Science fiction fandom, like, it's basically the same as everywhere else. Fandom is fandom. It's really weird how you can be anywhere and go to a science fiction convention and be like, oh, these are my people. But we have two major conventions, one in Salt Lake and one in Provo. And it's basically the same with a lot less drinking. So that's basically it. So, you know, I guess more Jell-O and Sprite and less alcohol. Which, you know, for some people, science fiction conventions are all about the drinking, so that may be a horrifying thought, but, you know, yeah, that's just basically it. All right, we'll go up here and then we'll come down here, so.
Going back to a little bit of your original discussion, I had a chance to speak to a music professor recently, a theorist who was working on mathematical structures to describe all basically acceptable chord progressions.
Okay.
And
wow.
he gave
Unifying theory of music there, huh?
He goes through this whole discussion, but one of the things he concluded with is, and for all of that, we can't say anything intelligent about taste.
Yeah.
Other than, well, there's some social reasons, like, you know, if you grew up with a lot of punk rock, you like punk rock.
Right.
Other than that, we can't say anything really intelligent about taste. Is it different in writing? Do we have any idea of what's going on with taste?
I mean, we can talk about some of the things. We can talk about the monomyth, Joseph Campbell and the heroic archetype, which is very present in fantasy. We could talk about resonance with various archetypes, but in the end, we really can't say a lot about taste. We can say that science fiction and fantasy people, interestingly, one of the biggest factors in taste seems to be your desire or lack of desire for reading the same thing again. If that makes any sense, like that has a huge impact on what people read. Science fiction and fantasy kind of walks this weird tenuous line because most of what we do, people want to read something that inspires the same feelings but is different at the same time. Because often what inspired the same feelings in us, or inspired powerful feelings, what we loved about it, was the sense of discovering something new. And so if that sense of discovering something new is why you're reading, then we want to get that same feeling. But we can't get that same feeling from the exact same book or same type of book. It has to be evolving. And so because of that, I feel our genre is pushed to evolve at an accelerated rate compared to perhaps some other genres. There are a lot of people who like to read a book because the style and form of the book is comfortable. And so what they're looking for is a new story on top of the same style and form. If you want to read a cozy mystery, that's what that is. If you basically, a lot of the thriller archetypes are like that. And so the books are not going to change, and the characters don't change a lot because of that. And so that type of reader is looking for less new and more familiar. With us, we tend to, as a genre, like the new quite a bit. We ran into some troubles with this with the epic fantasy genre. I'm now kind of just editorializing. I don't have hard facts to back this up. But late 90s, if you look at the numbers, epic fantasy took a plunge. And this is basically only the new authors. Established authors still continue to sell, but new authors took a nosedive. And there were several very high-profile flops. The biggest one that people talk about is Robert Newcomb, The Fifth Sorceress. But there were several others that, we wonder if epic fantasy kind of was falling into too much of the same. And people started jumping ship for children's. Because children's was being more new and more innovative in fantasy with people like Garth Nix and even J.K. Rowling and some of these things. And we don't know what it was, but epic fantasy took a big hit. And so with taste, it seems like for us, we want to read something new. But we also want it to feel like everything we've read before, but we want it to feel like that in a new way. And so it's a really tough genre to write in for some of those reasons. Okay, right here and then down here. So we'll just move through this and then we'll move through this. Okay.
Yeah. So this is returning to the topic of religion-related issues again, and possibly. So there seems to be at least some perception that historically a lot of sci-fi and fantasy was written by either high church Anglicans or Catholics, especially people like C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien,
Right.
and that now there's a disproportionately large Mormon presence, yourself and also as prominent examples.
Yes.
So do you think there are actually disproportionate numbers in different religious groups, and if so, why do you think is the cause for that demographic?
You know, people like to talk about this. What is it with Mormons and science fiction? You know, everyone has their pet theory, because I'm not sure if there's a disproportionate number or not, but it seems like there are, because there's me, there's Stephanie Meyer, there's Orson Scott Card, there's Shannon Hale, there's a large number, David Farland, you know, I could go on and on. I've got my own pet theories. I don't know that they hold any weight, but I'll tell you what they are, because I do that. I think that science fiction and fantasy in the era when we were growing up was a safe counterculture. This is my academic side. So you get a lot of good Mormon kids who, you know, don't want to go out drinking, but they want to rebel. And so what do? They start playing D&D, or they start reading these fantasy and science fiction books that, you know, the good Mormon heritage parents don't really understand at all, because, you know, it's just the pioneer work ethic. It's what the whole Mormon thing is. This, you know, pioneer work ethic. We're all going to be business people, right? And then you get this generation of everyone's like, no, we're going to be science fiction writers, ha ha. I think there's that. I think that's one of my theories. You know, it's a way to kind of rebel and do something. One reason might be there's a very strong focus on reading and literacy in the community. And so I think if you just have a disproportionate number of readers, you have a disproportionate number of writers. And that's probably what it is. That you're just getting any community where you have a lot of readers, you're going to end up with a lot of writers. And it could be, you know, how to say this delicately. I do believe in my religion. I have faith in my religion, but it does sound a bit like science fiction. And I'll admit that. I mean, part of Mormon theology is the belief that that there are other planets with other people living on them, and part of the Mormon theology is the idea that, you know, the Earth is a training ground, a place we come to learn, and that you know, after we die we'll continue to progress, and things like that. And there is some science fiction element to that sounds science fiction-y, not Scientologist level, thank goodness. But there is some of that. I think that the LDS culture, as opposed to, you know, you can really only compare in this case LDS culture to something like a deep, maybe South. Christian, you know, born again. It's really interesting if you look at like the demographics, which I love to look at. You know, you often see this kind of swath of whatever down in the Bible Belt, and then Utah, wherever you know. And so there are some similarities there, but down in this swath, there's more of a feeling that this is. You know, that this is counter to religious ideas, where in LDS theology, we're not kind of really, the theology itself is not worried about the concept of other races and other planets and things like this. We're very comfortable with it, so maybe that's part of it. But see, we're really just all editorializing, and usually the answers are simpler than we think they are. And I really think it probably just comes down to, you know, high literacy, high number of readers, and that sort of thing. So there you go, that's my answer. I don't know if it's much of an answer, but it's the closest I can get. In New York, they think it's the science fiction answer. I've asked them. All right, your question.
Actually, it's a segue from your former answer, talking about the epic fantasy plot. So
Yeah.
I worked in a bookstore for 9 years.
Okay.
High school college, so on and so forth.
Right.
And I watched the science fiction fantasy section shrink and become stagnated. And
Right.
more recently, it started, you know, pick up pace again with new writers like yourself and Rothfuss and all the other great ones that are coming in. And I was kind of wondering what you would attribute to this new, almost genre, not
Right.
so much, but new generation of
Right.
writers.
Everyone's going to have their theories on this one too, and I can only offer mine. I was, you know, for many years just a reader. I have spoken to a lot of people who seem to have the same experience that I had, that were very dissatisfied with the genre in the late 90s. Basically, what we had happen is, so back in the, you know, for a long time, science fiction and fantasy had not been a hardcover genre, had not been a best-selling genre. It grew out of the pulps, it grew out of fandom, is really where it grew out of. If you go back and talk about Asimov and some of these people, they were attending the science fiction conventions, and they were part of it, and they grew out of the community. And so it was almost an amateur first genre. Which, you know, it grew out of the pulps and things like that. So it was not a mainstream genre until Star Wars really started to change the game. And Lord of the Rings to an extent. Lord of the Rings really sold well and woke people up. And so during the 70s, you had a bunch of science fiction and fantasy imprints start, new ones for the first time. And during the 80s, science fiction and fantasy actually became bankable. As a hardcover genre, and it was really the 90s, and it was honestly Robert Jordan who did it. Robert Jordan, and to a lesser extent, David Eddings, and some of these people, Anne McCaffrey certainly, some of these writers, 80s and early 90s, became bankable hardcover novelists that were hitting the tops of the bestseller list. And because of this, science fiction fantasy suddenly drew a lot of attention. And during the early 90s, you had a large number of superstars break out. Robert Jordan, Robin Hobb, who had had a lot of trouble under Megan Lindholm name, but then broke out in the 90s under a new pseudonym. You had Robert Jordan, George R. R. Martin, Robin Hobb, and Goodkind. All just hit super big in the first half of the 90s. And everybody's eyes were on them. And Goodkind is an excellent example of what happened. Because suddenly this was a bankable genre, the money for advances started to skyrocket. And so, for instance, Goodkind was famous when he first published his book because it was the first fantasy book to go to a really big auction by a new author and sell for a ton of money. I think it was $750,000 for the trilogy in whatever, 94, whenever he did it, which was enormous for our genre. That was huge. And Goodkind came out and they put a huge marketing push behind him. And from what I'm told, that they put him in the same slot that Robert Jordan had, but he hadn't turned in a book that year. So when Robert Jordan started turning him in every other year, so they put a Goodkind book in there, and they just publicized the crud out of it. And the book sold like hotcakes. And suddenly in New York, there was this feeling that big fantasies can be turned into bestsellers. And I worry, just looking at an armchair, that some of the Hollywood mentality creeped in. You know what Hollywood, if you watch what Hollywood will do, if something gets big, then suddenly everyone's like, these movies do great. And they snatch up all the rights and make a whole bunch of terrible films that are like that one that don't do very well. And then they say, well, that genre's dead. Right? This happened to 2D animation in the 90s. Disney Renaissance happened. These were making huge amounts of money, and so everybody jumped on the bandwagon and made some pretty decent ones, but the quality fell off really fast, and you ended up with stuff like Barnyard or whatever. And these movies were all doing very poorly, and they're like, well, 2D animation is dead. Well, no, you made some terrible movies that didn't sell. But in Hollywood, there's an adage which really bothers me, and the adage goes, if execution matters, we don't want to fund it. Meaning, if it's not going to be successful regardless of how well it turns out, we don't want to fund it. Now, they would of course rather that it turn out really well, but they don't want to put that much money into it unless it's going to sell, even if it doesn't turn out really well. And so what happened in science fiction and fantasy is, this is just my feeling reading it, you hear about in the really late 90s, early 2000s, huge auctions for big lots of money, big amounts of money for these new authors that they were going to try and push, and they all flopped. And so suddenly the genre got kind of wiped out, partially because they were putting out the same sort of thing, but also partially because of these flops, where suddenly advances pulled back, and everyone was scared of fantasy now. And so suddenly you didn't have very big breakouts. I mean, really, the only really big superstar that came out of that period is Jim Butcher. And he got there with urban fantasy during the kind of urban fantasy renaissance. Steven Erikson should have, but he didn't break out in superstar status. He's only now started to really get a lot of traction. He was an underground hit for a long time in the science fiction fantasy community, but he didn't start really getting big, and he should have. But it's because of this sort of feeling, I think, that happened. And now, finally, I think we're recovering from that, and we're seeing some new authors come out that are doing these things.